In 1865, the Civil War ended. Slavery was abolished, and the Emancipation Proclamation gave African Americans the right to vote. This document, however, did not give the right to vote to women. A brave group of women began a struggle that lasted almost 3/4 of a century to obtain that right. Tonight, you will hear the story of that struggle in the words of Lillian Kerr, a Colorado suffragette, in a one-act play written and acted by Carol Woolman, member of the St. Vrain Historical Society and historical actress. Much of the dialogue comes from the actual words of Lillian Kerr. The Dickens Opera House and Tavern and the Longmont television production group Eyes on Longmont are proud to present Lillian Kerr.
Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
Hello, I'm Lillian Kerr, and I've come back from the past to tell you a story about my life as a suffragette and my involvement in the women's suffrage movement. Now, suffrage is it's a word that's not much used anymore, I'm told, but it comes from the word suffragium, which is Latin for to support or to vote for. So a suffragette was a woman engaged in the cause of securing the right to vote for women. Now, my story begins in 1867 when I was born in Independence, Iowa. The only daughter in a large family of boys. So I learned at a very young age to defend myself and became quite an independent spirit. I moved with my family to Archer County, Texas, where my father was a land agent and later became a judge. Oh, I can remember riding with him from town to town as he conducted his business, and it raised quite a few eyebrows to see a young girl traveling with her father like that. Oh, Texas was a wide open, wild place with a lot of violence between the homesteaders and the cattle ranchers. But I loved the excitement and the adventure of it. That love of excitement and adventure remained with me all of my life. Now, my father is the one who introduced me to Robert Kerr, a young lawyer there in Archer County. Now, Robert was a Civil War veteran and quite a hero in that war. Why, in one battle, he carried his wounded comrades, one after the other, out of the line of fire, at great risk to his own life and safety. He was wounded in that war, but he survived. He was one of 119 men who returned from his company of 3,200 men. Oh, that was a bloody war, pitting North against South and son against father and brother against brother. But after the war, Robert attended university in Boston and became a lawyer in New York City. Well, the Wild West called to him, like it did all of us in those days. And he settled in Archer County, Texas. And when we were introduced, we were immediately attracted to one another. But I wasn't ready to marry anyone just then. I was busy teaching music in the schools. They called me the music teacher on horseback because I rode from school to school on my favorite horse, a mare I called Dolly. Oh, I love that horse. I used to braid her mane every night and comb it out in curls the next day. Well, the truth be told, I was reluctant to marry because I worried a lot about the population explosion in the country at the time and the condition of many women in the married state. But Robert was a patient man. Would you believe it took him 10 years to convince me to marry him? But marry we did. And we moved to Colorado in 1895. Oh, Colorado was such a beautiful place. But there was something else that appealed to me about coming here. Colorado already allowed women to vote, having secured that right in 1893 through a general election. The first state to do so, by the way. Oh, Wyoming already allowed women to vote, but they had written it into their constitution because they needed the bodies. And Utah had allowed women to vote, but they rescinded that right after a little bit. So I was convinced that if a woman were ever going to improve her lot in life, she would need the vote to do it. Now, we settled in Colorado Springs. We bought a house on Tejon Street, and Robert opened his law office and later became a county judge. He was also instrumental in founding the El Paso County Bar Association. Now, we didn't have any children, so I had time to devote to the social issues, which were always uppermost in my mind, namely the rights of women. Do you know that women had hardly any rights at all then? If she had an inheritance and she married, her husband assumed immediate control of all her money. And if she worked, her salary was paid to her husband. The idea, of course, being that women weren't intelligent enough to manage money. She also had no say about the welfare of her own children, as he was their sole legal guardian. In the case of divorce, he could take all her money and her children, and she had no recourse under the law. And do you know that there were some men that even debated as to whether or not a woman had a soul? Yes, the prejudice against women ran very deep, and so did the ignorance. And I never could understand when the Constitution of the United States talks about equal rights for all the people, why women were excluded from representation at the ballot box. Were we not also part of all the people? It wasn't fair that half the population of this country could not vote. Well, I set about to do what I could to change things. And I joined other suffragettes in Colorado who adopted as our motto, not for ourselves alone, but for others as well. It wasn't enough that a couple of states allowed women to vote. We wanted an amendment to the Constitution which would guarantee the right to vote to women in every state. And we traveled throughout the country speaking on behalf of the Woman's Suffrage Amendment, which stated the right of citizens to vote in the United States shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And Congress shall have power to enact this legislation. Well, like I said, we traveled. Sometimes I traveled alone. And oftentimes I would write letters back to Washington, D.C., to Alice Paul, our leader, reporting on my progress or the lack thereof. And we gathered names on petitions, which we carried all the way to Washington, D.C., where we stood in front of the gates of the White House begging President Wilson to allow us to vote. We also marched in parades. Well, I remember one parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City where we carried the signatures of 1 million women. Oh, what chaos those parades caused. People jeering and yelling at us from the sidelines, using the most vile language. Now, to maintain our focus, we often sang songs. Now, one of the songs we sang was called "Keep Woman in Her Sphere," a favorite phrase among men in those days. Her sphere, of course, being home, hearth, and the kitchen. If I may, I would love to sing that song for you now so you can get a feel of what it was like then. Picture, if you will now, other women marching behind me and with me. And as we marched, we sang, "Keep woman in her sphere." I have a neighbor, one of those not very hard to find, who know it all without debate and never change his mind. I asked him what of woman's cause, the answer came severe. My mind on that is all made up, keep woman in her sphere. I saw a man in tattered garb forth from the grog shop come, who squandered all his cash on drink and starved his wife at home. I asked him, should not women vote? He answered with a sneer, I've taught my wife to know her place, keep woman in her sphere. I met an earnest, thoughtful man not many days ago, who pondered deep all human law, the honest truth to know. I asked him what of woman's rights. The answer came sincere. Her rights are just the same as mine. Let woman choose her sphere. Oh, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Oh, those were such exciting times. But dangerous too. Do you know that some of us, even 80-year-old women, 80-year-old women, educated women, genteel women, upper-class women even, were pushed down, kicked, beaten, spat upon, just because we wanted to vote? Oh, we had our detractors then. Some were even women. Well, there were some who called me a black devil and wondered how Robert could put up with me. But he was really a man ahead of his time and one of our staunchest supporters for the cause. But some women were afraid to join the cause because if a woman rebelled too much, her husband could have her declared insane and thrown into an asylum, which happened now and then. So she kept her silence. And then in 1916, we formed the National Woman's Party, specifically to support the woman's suffrage amendment. And then things really started to get going, to heat up, as you say today. Oh, we had more parades, bigger parades. We had rallies. We got louder. And thus ushered in the Night of Terror, November 15, 1917. I wasn't there that night. I had gone back to Colorado Springs to be with Robert. But the women were marching in front of the White House and picketing. And every time President Wilson drove out through the gates, the driveway, he got sick and tired of seeing all these women yelling at him, "Votes for women! Votes for women!" So we had them all arrested for obstructing sidewalk traffic. A sham of a trial was held. They were found guilty, of course, and thrown into Occoquan Workhouse, which was a prison just across the river in Virginia. A filthy, vile place. And the warden told his guards to teach these uppity suffrage women a thing or two for daring to picket Woodrow Wilson's White House and demand the right to vote. And when the night was over, the women were barely alive. 40 guards went on a rampage against 33 defenseless women, beating them, hanging them by their hands and beating them bloody, kicking, stripping, abusing, whipping. And it went on all night. It didn't get much better either in weeks to come. The only water they had to drink was from a dirty pail. The food they were given was filled with worms. Some of the women would gather the worms on their spoon and offer them to the guards. And then Alice Paul, who was among the women there at prison, decided she'd had enough of that wormy food, and she went on a hunger strike. And some of the women there joined her. Oh, well, the guards wouldn't put up with that. And they strapped the women down, put an iron contraption in their mouths to hold it open, and shoved a tube down to their stomachs, into which they poured a raw egg concoction. Oh, needless to say, the women vomited, gagged. Time after time, this was done for weeks. They were covered in sores and starving to death. And then Wilson and his cronies tried to get a psychiatrist to declare Alice Paul insane so she could be permanently institutionalized. Fortunately, this psychiatrist was a man of high moral character. And he declared, Alice Paul is a strong woman and courageous, but she wasn't crazy. And he went on to declare that courage in women is often mistaken for insanity. Then a note was smuggled out to the press, and the women were dubbed the iron-jawed angels. And this garnered some sympathy for us at that time, and I heard about it. I rushed back to Washington, D.C. to be with my fallen sisters. Wilson, not wanting any woman to die on his watch, had them released. I helped them as we dragged them out of prison, carried them, weak and starving and sick. Well, they recovered for a while. And then we marched right back out on those streets, where we stood at the gates in front of the White House, burning copies of Wilson's speeches that he gave in Europe, touting equal rights for all in America. Of course, we knew that wasn't true, didn't we? But through it all, I always said, women can do anything. Why, if this world is ever going to have any peace at all, it'll be up to women. Men's minds are keyed to combat. Women's minds are keyed to conservation. Why? Women have been engaged for centuries, for the most part, in cleaning up the messes men have made. I said even back then that peace would be the most important problem facing the world. And I wanted women to have a say in how the world was run, and it would begin with the vote. I told women everywhere I went that we were the political descendants of Susan B. Anthony, one of the most eloquent and prolific speakers for women's rights this country had ever seen. And we needed to carry on her banner, failure is impossible, until every one of us could cast our votes and have a say about our own welfare. Well, finally, after 72 years of hard work by many faithful and dedicated women, the amendment was approved by the Senate and the House in 1919. Now, stop for just a moment and think of this. 72 years. 72 years is a lifetime. It took a lifetime of those old men to die out between a new crop of men could rethink this issue of voting rights for women under the Constitution. Oh, we celebrated. But we needed the approval of at least 36 states for ratification. So we spread out across this country like an army of women, speaking to state legislatures in an effort to influence a favorable vote. Why, the governor of Wyoming called a special session of the legislature just to hear me speak. And slowly the votes began trickling in until one summer day in 1920, we needed just one more vote. That morning, before Harry Burns, a young 24-year-old congressman from Tennessee, went to the polls to cast his vote, his mother had put a note in his pocket. I've kept a copy of it all these years, and I'd like to read it to you, because, oh, it meant so much to me. In her note, Harry's mother says, "Dear son, vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were very bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy. With lots of love, Mama." Oh, I just love that. So he was a good boy that day, and he voted in favor of the women's suffrage amendment. And the 19th Amendment, the one we call the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was added to the Constitution. For the first time in the history of this country, women in every precinct could go to the polls and cast their votes. Our voices could finally be heard. What had begun in this country in 1848 as a revolution, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, who in later years, as they saw their efforts were not proving very fruitful, said to each other when they were old women, "Others will need to reap the seeds we have planted." And that's what happened when the battle was won in 1920 without ever having fired a shot. Oh, we celebrated. It was a glorious victory after so much hard work. I invited all the women to come to Colorado Springs, and we put on a big pageant in the Garden of the Gods where we depicted women from the past who were so important to this movement. I portrayed Amelia Bloomer, whose claim to fame is a piece of clothing she wore. Amelia was a contemporary of Susan B. Anthony. As they were working and not getting anywhere, Amelia said, "You know, we'll never have equal rights. We can't do the jobs men can do. We're hampered by these skirts we wear." And so she invented this outfit. It had long pants tied at the ankles and a skirt that came up to here, which gave them indeed much more freedom of movement. But oh, the hue and cry that went up across this nation when they saw the women in those outfits. Headlines screamed in every paper across the country. The audacity of these women to be seen in public in such outfits. Finally, Miss Anthony said, "Well, you know, we have to stop wearing these outfits because that's all they're talking about. They're not talking about our message." And so they went back to skirts. Well, women of today, before I talk about women of today, I want to mention one other thing about that pageant we held at the Garden of the Gods. That's when I helped write the Equal Rights Amendment. Oh, we appreciated getting the right to vote finally, but we wanted equality in every way. So we wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, which stated, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Simple enough, right? Oh, no. We presented it to Congress in 1923, and it was denied. Oh, and I also ran for a seat in Congress in 1923. Oh, alas, I lost that election. But I gave it a good try, and it was a thrill to be able to do so. And then in 1928, my dear husband Robert passed away. He was the love of my life, my staunchest supporter. It was such a difficult time for me then to lose him. And because he was a Civil War veteran, he's buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs among the other Civil War veterans there. But I managed to keep quite busy until I too passed away in 1962 at the age of 95. And per my request, my ashes were scattered in the beautiful garden of the gods. But women of today are reaping the benefits of those early, exciting years of the women's suffrage movement. And the National Woman's Party that we began in 1916 became the League of Women Voters, an organization dedicated to teaching women how to use their precious franchise. And I see now, as I look around, that people everywhere have come to realize that men and women alike, human beings, regardless of color or creed, deserve the equal rights promised us by that glorious document, the Constitution of the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. This is a story that I love to tell, as you can probably tell. I think it's a story worth telling because these women were largely forgotten. And so I love bringing them to life and reminding you how important the work they did was and what they went through to get the vote for us. So, don't forget to vote. Every vote counts.